You left a defenseless child to suffer in unimaginable pain. You stripped her of her innocence, her dignity, and her life. For that, this court sentences you to death." These were the final words of Judge Maria Castellan as she addressed Jonathan Richardson, the man responsible for one of the most horrifying crimes the town of Smithfield had ever seen. The courtroom was silent, save for the quiet sobs of jurors, family members, and seasoned officers who had never encountered such depravity. But who was Tegan Skiba, and how did her life end in such unfathomable tragedy? To understand the depth of this story, we must rewind to where it all began. We must go back to the choices, the neglect, and the horrifying events that led to the death of an innocent 4-year-old girl. Tegan Skiba was born in 2006 to Helen Reyes and Jerry Skiba. Her early life was difficult, marked by instability and struggle. Shortly after her birth, Tegan's father, Jerry, was imprisoned on drug charges, leaving Helen to raise her daughter on her own. Despite the challenges, Helen did her best to provide for Tegan, who was described as a sweet, bright-eyed girl with an infectious smile. Helen's love for Tegan was evident, but her decisions often put her daughter at risk. Financially strapped and juggling multiple jobs, Helen relied on others to help care for Tegan. In 2010, Helen began dating Jonathan Richardson, a 25-year-old man who, on the surface, seemed capable of helping her shoulder the responsibility. However, beneath his unassuming exterior, Richardson harbored deep-seated anger and a propensity for violence. In July 2010, Helen was called away for 2 weeks of Army Reserve training. Desperate for childcare, she made a decision that would have devastating consequences. She left Tegan in the care of Richardson. It was a decision she would come to regret for the rest of her life. Richardson took Tegan to a barn behind his grandparents' house in Smithfield, North Carolina. To those on the outside, the arrangement might have seemed odd but not alarming. However, what transpired inside that barn over the next 10 days would shock the nation. For reasons that remain incomprehensible, Richardson began torturing Tegan almost immediately after Helen left. Allegedly triggered by minor issues like bedwetting, Richardsons Rage spiraled out of control. He subjected the 4-year-old to relentless physical and psychological abuse. Tegan's small body bore the brunt of Richardson's fury. He beat her with a power cord, leaving deep welts across her back and legs. He bit her 66 times, according to forensic evidence, tearing her skin in multiple places. He struck her with a wooden rod, whipped her, and deprived her of food and water. At night, she was forced to sleep on the cold floor of the barn, surrounded by filth. The abuse didn't stop there. Richardson sexually assaulted Tegan repeatedly, leaving injuries so severe that medical professionals later testified they were among the worst they had ever seen. On July 16, 2010, after 10 days of unimaginable torture, Tegan collapsed. She was weak, dehydrated, and malnourished. Her tiny body had endured more pain than most adults could fathom. Panicking, Richardson realized she was unresponsive and drove her to Johnston Medical Center. He told doctors she had fallen out of bed, but the extent of her injuries told a different story. Medical staff were horrified. Tegan's body was covered in bruises, bite marks, and whip marks. Her brain was so swollen from repeated blows, that it began to protrude from her skull. But the severity of her injuries prompted her transfer to the University of North Carolina Hospital, but it was too late. Legan succumbed to her injuries and her death was ruled a homicide. The hospital staff immediately contacted law enforcement. Richardson was arrested on site and taken in for questioning. During the interrogation, he maintained his story, claiming Tegan had been injured by jumping off furniture. However, the evidence painted a far grimmer picture. Forensic experts discovered DNA evidence of Tegan's blood on over 30 items in the barn, including a wooden rod, clothing, and bedding. Bite mark analysis confirmed that the injuries on her body matched Richardson's dental impressions. The sheer volume of injuries, combined with the horrific nature of the abuse, left no doubt about Richardson's guilt. Richardson's trial began in Smithfield, North Carolina, and quickly became one of the most emotionally charged cases in the state's history. Jurors wept as they were shown autopsy photos of Tegan's injuries. Police officers, seasoned in dealing with violent crimes, broke down on the stand as they described the scene they had encountered. Dr. Jonathan Prevett, an assistant chief medical examiner, testified about the extent of Tegan's injuries. He described the deep welts from the power cord, the bite marks that tore her flesh, and the catastrophic brain damage caused by repeated blunt force trauma. Her injuries were consistent with prolonged and severe abuse, he told the court. This was not an accident. Richardson's defense team argued that he suffered from mental health issues and had been a victim of abuse himself. They claimed that while his actions were tragic, they were not premeditated. However, the jury was unconvinced. The evidence of premeditation, combined with Richardson's lack of remorse, led to a swift guilty verdict. On the final day of the trial, Judge Maria Castellan addressed Richardson directly. "Your actions were cruel beyond measure," she said. "You tortured a defenseless child, stripping her of her innocence and her life. For that, you will face the ultimate punishment." The jury recommended the death penalty, and Judge Castellan upheld their decision. Richardson was sentenced to death for first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. As he was led out of the courtroom, the room remained silent, the weight of the verdict hanging heavy in the air. While Richardson bore the brunt of the legal consequences, Helen Reyes was not absolved of responsibility. Prosecutors argued that her decision to leave Tegan with Richardson, despite knowing his history of violence, constituted gross negligence. Helen was convicted of felony negligent child abuse, resulting in serious bodily harm. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Tegan's death sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. Advocacy groups called for stricter regulations on child welfare and better screening for caregivers. Tegan's story became a symbol of the devastating consequences of neglect and abuse, sparking widespread conversations about how to protect vulnerable children. Tegan Skiba's story is one of unimaginable pain, but it's also a reminder of the importance of vigilance and accountability. If you've been moved by this story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Together, we can raise awareness and fight for a world where no child suffers in silence.